Thanks. How's everybody doing this afternoon? Enjoying the conference? All right. Like I said last night, and just in case some of you weren't here, I'm Kathy Pruden, and I'm the moderator here at Westwood. And it's our delight and our privilege to be hosting this conference. And I don't know about you, but there are a whole pile of ministry ideas that are just popping around in my head now. And I hope that that is what's happening with you, that perhaps as you take this back to your churches, that it will be the foundational kickoff for thinking about environmental care and our part in that. So enjoy this afternoon and enjoy all of the other stuff. Thanks.
Yes, I echo that. Just really have been enjoying all of you as we've been participating together in this experience. So I'm about to introduce Michael Gilmour, Dr. Michael Gilmour, who is giving us our next lecture here. You can read his bio in the pamphlet, so I'm not going to read that, but a little bit before this session, I asked Michael just a couple of questions that seem to be a little bit on point for us, which is, one of the questions I asked is, what is the most recent encounter in nature that has caused you wonder? And one of the things that he mentioned with that, there was actually a couple, but one of the ones that he mentioned was the pelican. It sounds like he has had time to enjoy the pelican out at Winnipeg Beach in particular, and if you haven't had the chance to see a pelican both far away and close, it is an awe and wonder for sure. The other question I asked Michael Gilmour was, we've been talking about watersheds, and I asked, is there a particular watershed that, or a place in a watershed that has been meaningful for you? And he actually let me know that actually the first watershed that really captured his heart was Lake Superior, growing up in Thunder Bay area, but both now being in Manitoba for some time, Lake Winnipeg has been capturing his heart as well. And both the wonder, power, that those large lakes can give has been a place of both, I think, sounds like both a place of solace, but also a place of just of wonder as well. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Michael to come share with us. We're looking forward to it.
Great, thank you, Scott. I have a handout that I'll just ask you to pass around, if you would. So I trust everyone's enjoying the conference. I know I am, and thank you, Sylvia, for your talk so far, and thank you, Scott and Zoe and the other organizers, and Graham. This has been a very inspiring time so far. A little show and tell to start with, if I can. I won't have time to kind of explore this topic as much as I would like, but I just wanted you to be aware that there is a lively conversation going on, lots of books that will further the conversation. I just brought a few here, and I'm just going to leave them somewhere up here. So later in the day, if you're wanting to flip through them, please do. And I won't go into any detail about them, but a recent book called Animal Theologians, a collection of essays by a variety of people on Christian and other religious traditions, thinkers that have given attention to animals. This targets more of an academic audience, as do some of the others, like Saul Olian's recent book, Animal Rights in the Hebrew Bible, which is a very intriguing study, particularly looking at some of the legal language of Torah. Andrew Lindsay's Why Animal Suffering Matters, Philosophy, Theology, and Practical Ethics, which is a really nice introduction to some of the issues that I'd like to explore. Maybe the most substantial work of recent years is David Clough. I don't know if some of you might know that name, but his two-volume work here on animals. The first volume, subtitled Systematic Theology, and it does provide a nice historical survey of Christian thinkers from the Bible, from the New Testament forward. And then the second volume is on theological ethics. David also has started an organization called Creature Kind. I'll put the website up at the very end of the talk. But if you're looking for further resources, his website, Be Creature Kind, is very, very helpful. And in the website, he targets churches. And he focuses primarily on animal agriculture and why churches should be taking an interest in this. And then there's some lay-level books that also would be very helpful for church contexts. A Faith Embracing All Creatures, Addressing Commonly Asked Questions About Christian Care for Animals, and there's an edited collection, several different writers. We were talking about liturgies during the workshop with Sylvia just before lunch. This is I don't know if any of you have come across this book, but I've read this book more than once. I find it very inspiring. But Andrew Lindsay's Animal Rights, R-I-T-E-S, subtitle Liturgies of Animal Care. And so if you wanted to supplement your prayer life with a particular focus on sentient creatures, this is a really nice resource. And also he provides introductions to some of the patterns of worship across the centuries. And so this is a really useful book. And then finally, I'll just flag Laura Hobgood Oster's book, The Friends We Keep, Unleashing Christianity's Compassion for Animals. And I've assigned this to students in the past, and they've generally resonated well with this book. Laura teaches environmental studies and religion in Texas. She's also very active in the Texas Humane Society, and so she's both an advocate and a very deep thinker. But this is a very accessible, very beautifully written book with an emphasis on hospitality, being hospitable to our non-human neighbors. So I'll leave these around. These are just a kind of a random selection, but do feel free to flip through those if any of that is of interest. All right. Has everybody got a handout here? I guess I don't need to have these in front of me. I'll just throw them there for now. All right, so I'm aware of the time because Scott did say we have a bit of a tight schedule. So it may be an inelegant close. I've asked Scott just to flag when I'm done, and I'll just stop mid-sentence and we'll get that tree planted, and more importantly, the coffee, I guess, is what people will be looking for. So, that's true. Yeah, there we go. We can combine the two. So, if we can look at the next slide here, just a quick little illustration of something. I don't know if that's going to work from a distance or not, but you've all seen this kind of thing before where there's a picture embedded in a picture, and there's some that you don't necessarily see right away, and you have to squint a little bit to try to find it. Does everybody see the two different pictures that are going on here? There's two women, white dresses, and there's also an old man. Are you all seeing that? It might be the lighting. It's not helping us out here. But it's the kind of thing you might stare at a while and not quite capture what the painter is up to. But I wanted to present that. It's just a simple illustration of the big point that I wanted to flag this afternoon. Is that there is another story. Well, there are many stories in the Bible. We read the surface narrative, and I assume most here are generally familiar with it. But sometimes, if we squint just right, and if we read between the lines, and if we are attentive to the details in texts, and Sylvia's talks have been illustrating this during her presentations, we begin to realize that there are other stories going on. And that's what I would like to explore a little bit today. Where do animals fit in the big picture? And this, we're talking about creation as a whole, and I'd like to just focus things a wee bit further with this presentation and think about animals. And to begin, I wanted to pick up on the bird walk theme that was the day began with. I didn't make it to the bird walk myself, but I did a dog walk that involved listening to birds along the way. So we'll pick up on that idea, and it's going to come across like a short sermon, mini sermon. So don't leave when I say amen, because it won't be done. But I wanted to present this talk as something. This first part of the talk is something of an illustration that involves something along the line of that. That if we look at the text, we see something a little bit more, not necessarily different, but more than what we might often read. And one quick thing about this particular artist's picture is that the two different pictures that are there are deliberate. The two ladies are there. The old man with the white beard is there, and that's by design. And so my big point for this talk is to say that there is a story for non-human creation. That much I think we all agree on, and that there is also a story about sentient creatures in particular. And you might anticipate kind of this is where I'm going to go with it, that I think this has moral implications for us. The church has responsibilities for the earth, including the earth animals. So let's begin with some birds. Let birds fly above the earth across the dome of the sky. So goes the first page of the Bible, just 20 verses into that rather longish book. And those birds never leave. Not only do they fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven, as the Authorized Version puts it, they also make at least 300 other appearances, both symbolic and otherwise. Think of Noah's raven and dove, or those bringing food to Elijah, or the crowing cock announcing Peter's denial. There are lovely poetic descriptions of the forgetful ostrich and the majestic birds of prey in Job, as well as all those regulations in Torah clarifying what birds are suitable for food and sacrifice. For Jeremiah, the absence of birds represents desolation, and other writers liken God's care to a bird watching over a nest, covering her young with wings. We could flip to the next slide if that's all right. There we go. That looks a little more interesting, perhaps. Hosea imagines the end of exile as the return of migratory birds, and peacocks are emblematic of Solomon's grandeur and wealth. The Spirit of God descends in the form of a dove at Jesus' baptism, and the strange visions of Ezekiel, Daniel, and John the Seer include mysterious creatures resembling an eagle. The Bible is full of birds. These avian-laden pages also include remarks touching on ethics. For instance, in Deuteronomy 22, verses 6 and 7, if you come on a bird's nest in any tree or on the ground with fledglings or eggs, with the mother sitting on the fledglings or on the eggs, you shall not take the mother bird with her young. Let the mother go, taking only the young for yourself, in order that it may go well with you and you may live long. That might have been the experience some of you had this morning, finding fledglings. That's an interesting passage because notice the import of that, flagged in that last phrase. Do this or don't do this in order that it may go well with you and you may live long. There's something serious about this instruction. What does it mean? Why let the mother bird go? Sometimes the Torah regulations we find hint at we might think of as a practical wisdom. So allowing a laboring animal to rest on Sabbath, as we read in Exodus 23:12, that makes sense. I guess I'm not a farmer, but I would assume that a laboring animal that's well rested is probably going to be more productive. And that little detail in itself, though, is worth noting. The animals rest with the people on Sabbath. But that's potentially a very practical wisdom that the ancient farmers might have appreciated. A rested animal is healthier, more productive, and potentially more useful, profitable. But what about that wild mother bird? What direct benefit is there for the one who comes upon that nest and lets her go? Maybe some ancient ecological wisdom, or maybe the sense is simply, you've already taken that bird's eggs, causing her distress, so harm her no further. And I might add to that line of thinking, Exodus 23 verses 10, 11 also refers to allowing the land to have a Sabbath rest. Why? In part, so that the poor may get food from the land and the wild animals. The animals themselves benefit by these Sabbath laws. So mentioning the poor is a familiar idea, but the inclusion of wild animals less so. How does that benefit the human community? I'm not sure it even does. But for whatever reason, God does not want humans killing those mother birds. And maybe we don't need to understand why. Maybe it's God's business, and that, for readers who consider Torah an authority, ought to be reason enough. What is clear is that compassion for wild birds is an ethical imperative. And what is more, an ethical imperative with that theological motivation that I mentioned. Let the bird go, that it may go well with you, and you may live long. The benefit is divine favor, even if the practical reason behind it, sparing that bird, remains a mystery to us. More birds. In the priestly creation story of Genesis, God sees the creatures of the sea and every winged bird of every kind and declares them good. On the sixth day, God sees all land animals, both domestic and wild, and declares them good. The goodness has nothing to do with human beings in that text, who only appear after everything else has been made, and only after God celebrates those birds and other living things. Genesis chapter 2 is the reverse order. Birds and other animals are good simply because God makes them and is pleased with them. Now, that's the bit of a setup for kind of a little bit of dissonance that I want to present when we think about those ancient texts in the context of the contemporary world. So what should we think about the following practices as those who take the Bible seriously? Is there room for a conversation here about morality? It is routine to de-beak newly hatched chicks raised on factory farms, which means cutting and cauterizing the upper part of the beak. No anesthesia. A chicken's beak has nerves, so the process inflicts pain. Male chicks hatched at intensive egg-producing operations are surplus, and so dispensed with, often in grisly ways: suffocation, electrocution, grinding them alive. Producing foie gras, a food delicacy, involves force-feeding ducks or geese by putting tubes down their throats and stuffing abnormal quantities of food down their throats. This causes the liver to swell, and it also causes various other injuries, lacerations from the tubes and exploding organs among them. The tips of turkeys' toes are frequently cut off to prevent bored and overcrowded birds at factory farms from harming one another. Again, no anesthesia. The extent of avian suffering is staggering. 7 to 10 billion, with a B, 7 to 10 billion chickens are slaughtered for food each year in the United States alone, and estimates put the number in Canada somewhere north of 600 million. That's a staggering number. And that's just the birds. Is it unreasonable to suggest the scale of animal suffering, birds and all others, ought to be a concern for communities of faith, for those who take the Bible seriously? The issue, however, rarely comes up in the context of our churches, apart from maybe the occasional animal blessing service in October when St. Francis' feast day comes around. And I wonder why this is. And two quick thoughts come to mind. First, Christians quickly acknowledge biblical calls for compassion, generosity, and self-sacrifice. But our instinct is, understandably, to care for those closest to home in various senses of the word: family, friends, tribe, region, nation, race. We gravitate towards our own, perfectly understandable. And it's no wonder that the Bible then calls us to love the unlovable sometimes. To love your enemies, for instance, pray for those who persecute you, that kind of thing. We need to be reminded to do that. So love knows no boundaries when thought of in that respect. So care for non-Israelite sojourners in the land. Care for them, as Moses says, or turn the other cheek when enemies strike, as Jesus says. But a duty to care for other species, that's a trickier one. Can love thy neighbor as thyself really extend that far? So that's the first guess I have about why maybe we're reluctant collectively as the church to think about these things. And second, we sometimes act as though there's not enough kindness to go around. And I've heard more than once the term priorities, that when I do speak on this on occasion in classrooms or in settings where Christians gather, that the issue of priorities tends to come up. We have other more important things to do, and they're just animals after all. And that's sort of where the heart kind of takes a hit. So of course, protecting vulnerable and needy people among us is an urgent priority. And notice that that's flagged by Exodus 23. Let the land rest so that the poor may eat. But to assume that we cannot show simultaneously concern for our animal neighbors, I think is theologically problematic. And again, remember Exodus 23. Let the land rest so the poor may eat, but also so that the wildlife may eat. It's a both and that I think we need to pursue here. That line of thinking of priorities, it implies that God's love for the church, God's love and the church's capacity for compassion and showing that love is in short supply, and neither is the case. Animals it's not an either-or issue. Animal ethics should not be an either-or issue. When Paul writes of the groaning creation and its bondage to decay, which Sylvia mentioned last evening, it is in the context of eschatological hope. Animal suffering will end one day. Justice will come. There will be no factory farms on the renewed earth because it is incongruent with the visions of peace found in the writings of St. Paul or Isaiah and elsewhere. So the question I put forward to you, and again, remember this is sort of a pretend sermon that I'm giving here. The question that I put to you, congregation, is whether we will participate in that work of the Spirit Paul describes and do our part to end creation's groaning in the present. Will our actions be proleptic in that sense, anticipating the kingdom to come? Will our actions correspond to our repeated prayer, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven? So again, that all sounds like I kind of rounded off a sermon and we're all ready to sing the doxology and have coffee, but not yet. Hang on. This little bird-brained sermon is just an illustration. So clearly, just a way to talk, to illustrate that this kind of sermon, this kind of talk, is not usual fare for our churches. I've asked more than once for my own congregation to have an animal blessing service, and that's just dead silence. See, that thought is way too much. And some of you, I'm sure, are well aware, whether it's bringing in issues of environmental concern or issues of animals specifically, it's a very hard conversation to get started. Even in the context of my employer, a couple of my colleagues are here. That's a hard conversation to get started, and I've tried over a number of years to get the attention of the administration to think about these topics. So that's the challenge, but I would like to push further ahead than this little bird talk and present something of the foundations or part of the foundations for why I think this conversation is important. So we'll move on to the handout and the next slide if we could. And I always enjoy an excuse to talk about C.S. Lewis in any context. This is that little excerpt on the handout. I came across this a couple of years ago, and I was over the moon when I read this for the first time. It's buried away in the third volume of C.S. Lewis's published letters, which is if you've seen it, it's a collection of some 3,600 plus pages. It's an enormous collection, and in a handwritten letter, he wrote this poem for a colleague at University of Cambridge. And he didn't title it. The poem as a whole is 4 9-line stanzas. He wrote it in 1958, but it was not published until 2007. It's almost 50 years after his death. So Lewis included these lines, as I mentioned, in a letter to his colleague Francis Turner, and he refers to it, as you can see, as my Easter hymn. And the whole hymn is absolutely beautiful. You get the impression that it was kind of dashed off, and he's very modest about it, even in the letter. He doesn't seem entirely satisfied with the meter, and he remarks to his friend Francis Turner, if the numbers are unpleasing, referring to the scansion of the poem, the sentiments, since they are scriptural, must surely be just. And that line jumped off this letter to me. If the numbers are unpleasing, if it's not a great poem in itself, the sentiments, since they are scriptural, must surely be just. And the whole piece rewards close reading, as I said, but I call attention to just the third stanza, which is the one on your handout, which, after proclaiming the Lord's victory over the devil and death, he was a medievalist that enjoyed the paintings that involve Christ breaking into Hades and breaking the chains, and that whole notion of Christ descending to hell, which we have in the Apostles' Creed. He loved that image, not necessarily his particular interpretation of his own theological opinion about it, but he loved the imagery of that. And so he mentions this idea of Christ defeating the devil and death and the ransomed legions he drags out of hell, and he tells them to rise and dance. And then the poem makes the surprising swerve that it does in that stanza that you have on the handout. Bear, behemoth, bustard, which is a bird of some kind, camel, warthog, wombat, kangaroo, insect, reptile, fish, and mammal, tree, flower, grass, and lichen to rise and ramp awaking. Oh, I love that line. For the age-old curse is breaking. All things shall be made new. Nature's rich rejuvenation follows on man's liberation. I say unexpected because the poem presents us with a startling vision of redemption that is associated with, but emphatically not limited to, Christ's rescue of humanity. And this theme has come up a couple times already during the conference. Nature's rich rejuvenation follows on man's liberation. If we jump to the next slide, if we could, you'll recognize that this rhyming couplet is an echo of Romans 8. Which describes the whole creation waiting for the revealing of the children of God, groaning along with them, all together awaiting redemption. People, animals, indeed the whole of nature are on this journey together, according to St. Paul. Next slide, if we could. There we go. There's a warthog for you. These sentiments, again, as Lewis phrases it, since these sentiments are scriptural, they must surely be just. This echo of Romans chapter 8. But of course, as I was saying earlier, this is not the view held by all. From as far back as Augustine and Aquinas through to the present, there have been many who argue that animals are not morally consequential, and they, like the rest of creation, are of utilitarian value, if anything. A backdrop for the human story, perhaps, useful for food, for labor, for warfare, for entertainment, perhaps. But they are much more consequential than that, according to Lewis's reading of Romans. Everything changed for animals too on Easter morning. They too are part of God's rescue of the world through Christ. They too, when the kingdom comes in its fullness, are to be set free. And they too, like us, are to be made anew, for the age-old curse is breaking. I was going to jump in. I'm going to skip over a little section here, just in the interest of time. I'm not going to skip over it. I was going to pause to ask a question, just to throw it back out to you before I ramble on too much further. But did anybody have any thoughts of why do you think collectively we are reluctant as the church to think about animals as this part of creation that have moral relevance? Does anyone have any kind of just thoughts on that topic before? Yeah, very good. Yeah, I missed who said that, but I think that's absolutely right. And dominion interpreted as we can do whatever we want with it. And it certainly has had that very negative effect on the church's history. Who's that? I'm forgetting the name offhand. Who's the fellow that, White, late 60s? What's the name? That's the name, that's right, yeah. He's one who can famously blame the church for the ecological crisis that was emerging. Yeah, so I think dominion is a big one, kind of overlooking the fact that the very next verse in Genesis 1, it talks about the naked vegetarians that Sylvia's mentioned a few times. So whatever dominion means, it clearly means something different than despotism. It's yeah. Any other thoughts on that? Yeah. Mm-hmm. The image of God. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right too. Yeah, yeah. There's good reasons why this issue is just in some ways kind of one we want to avoid because it's complicated, as you say, for all kinds of reasons. Well, keep thinking about that too. About maybe we can pick that up a little bit with some Q&R afterwards. So, a quick biographical note, and if we could flip to the next slide here, just a quick. One of the places that for me this whole area of interest began was with the verse that's also on the handout here, and I was struck by this, and I don't remember when this was years ago, but. There's that remarkable speech that God gives to Job, Job chapters 38, 39, and you know the story of Job, how it's him looking at his own difficult circumstances for the first 37 chapters. He's lost everything, and friends are less than helpful, and he's calling out to God for relief and for an explanation. And famously, as I suspect you're all aware, that God never really does answer Job's questions. And what Job does is remarkable, is that he in effect says, take your eyes off yourself, look around you. And there's a long string of questions about, do you know when this happens, or why that happens, or have you noticed that the weather does this and the animals do that? And it's this shift towards an outward gaze, which I find so helpful for me in that it disorients me in a useful way. And one of the particular passages in this section that sort of jumped out at me years ago and kind of got my thoughts stirred in this direction was this phrase here about who has cut a channel for the torrents of rain and the way for the thunderbolt to bring rain on the land where no one lives, where no human lives. Other things live there, of course, and God explains all kinds of creatures that Job is just clearly not thinking about. And it just sparked something in my brain to say that I am not all there is. I'm not the center of the universe. I and we are not the center of all there is. And we are, of course, important. We play a part in the grand scheme of things. But there are other stories going on too. And so for me, this one moment in the text, along with writers like C.S. Lewis, have provided some of the imaginative resources to rethink the Bible. And when I kind of first got thinking about that, it involved rereading it again, going through Genesis to Revelation and trying to find out what else is going on beyond my own my own interests and my own, our own relationships with God, or however you want to phrase that. So that passage began this conversation in my head, and I'd like to build on that idea of who sent the rain, where did and of course this idea of a creation that has meaning to God apart from us. And I'm going to pick up on that, as I say in the handout, at point number 3, a little bit more aqua exegesis. So we're in the rain for a moment. Now we're going to jump into the sea with Jonah and with Noah. And this is not, I'm not a Hebrew Bible scholar, so I'll defer to Gordon and others, and then Laurie and others in the room that are. But what I want to do here is mash up these stories a little bit and suggest that they might provide us just a first step to be thinking about a Christian perspective on non-human animals. So again, this is not so much an analysis of the flood narrative or Jonah as a mashup of the two to prompt reflections on a more inclusive theology. And I'll get to the handout in a moment, but yes, you can already see there that one of the things I'll suggest is that if we begin with these very familiar stories about Noah and Jonah, there are elements in these stories that we can carry with us into our reading of other texts, including New Testament texts. So again, we tend to be rather like Job. We tend to be myopic, at least I should say, I speak for myself. I tend to be very self-absorbed, gazing in the mirror, refusing to step away from it, focused on my own concerns, even though God sends the rain to places where no human lives. The Noah story and the Jonah stories, they both challenge this inclination. And again, I chose these texts for a couple of reasons, but two primary ones. First, they're generally familiar to all. This is my first Rocha conference. I didn't quite know the makeup of the congregation. But these stories, whether you're a Bible reader or not, I'm guessing are generally familiar to most people. So that was one reason. Second, these stories decenter humanity from the sacred dramas that are unfolding. Or at least, maybe better put, they highlight the coexistence of humans with other animals. Jesus loves me, this I know, the Bible tells me so, but yes, that's true, but that's not the whole story. And these narratives maybe help us move away from that selfish way of thinking. We find a more inclusive vision. So as a thought experiment, let's put Jonah and Noah into conversation for a moment and note various elements that they share. There are a number of parallels. The main setting of both is a watery world and a cataclysmic storm. Each narrative has a human prophet and depicts the rescue of God's messenger, by means of an ark in the one, of course, and by means of a fish in the other. According to Genesis, upright Noah found favor with God and walked with God, Genesis 6. And according to traditions reflected in 2 Peter 2:5 and Josephus and elsewhere, Noah preached righteousness to a sinful world. Likewise, Jonah's assignment was a preaching gig, sent to the wicked Assyrians, calling them to repentance. In Jonah 1 verse 2, God tells Jonah to go to Nineveh because of the wickedness of that great city. But the narrative stresses Jonah's mission is to the city of Nineveh, repeating the term and the name several times puts the stress on its human inhabitants. 1 verse 2, 3 verses 2 to 5, 4 verse 11. Human wickedness has consequences for the earth and for its inhabitants. And that's an idea that we find in a few other places, and I'll come back to that in a moment. The flood narrative is broader in scope, of course. Not only is it the whole world that grieves God and faces judgment in Genesis 6, but we're told it's all flesh that is corrupt. Not just people, but all life on earth that has the breath of life on land. Chapter 7, verses 21 and 22. These stories also stress the shared fate of all living things. Human representatives board the ark, but of course, so too do representatives of all other species. Human and non-human animals alike also die in the diluvian waters. As it says in 6 verse 17, all flesh in which is the breath of life, everything that is on the earth shall die. Everything on dry land in whose nostrils is the breath of life died, 7 verse 22. People and animals experience judgment together. People and animals experience salvation together. One beautiful moment in this otherwise terrifying tale occurs after the floodwaters cover the earth, as we're told that God remembered wild and domestic animals. Isn't that lovely? chapter 8, verse 1. He remembers Noah too, of course, but he remembers the wild and domestic animals. Additionally, notice that God enters into covenant with the people, with the earth, and with its diverse residents. And Sylvia also highlighted this for us last night, and I love that comment about the bow. I'd never thought that before. That was just lovely. The bow as a weapon versus the bow that's not used for violence. So God says to Noah in chapter 9, I'm establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. Such lovely lines. A similar assertion about divine concern for all life on earth occurs in Jonah. We're told Nineveh's human and animal residents repent. Catch that. That's funny. That's worth laughing at. I think by design. We're told that all living things in Nineveh repented. And while we should certainly appreciate the humor of the scene, Jonah 3 verses 7 and 8 is remarkable for what it tells us about the shared fate of human and non-human animals. So here's the verses. The king of that great city announces, no human being or animal, no herd or flock shall taste anything. They shall not feed. They shall not drink water. Human beings and animals shall be covered with sackcloth, and they shall cry mightily to God. All shall turn from their evil ways and from the violence that is in their hands. So it's a very unusual image to try to get in your mind. But before we dismiss the apparent absurdity of the scene, maybe as an odd Assyrian superstition or some such equivalent, let's not forget that God honors these expressions of repentance. So animals wearing sackcloth, animals fasting. And more striking yet, in this short book is the all-inclusive language of its last verse, which is one of the more beautiful verses in the Bible touching on animals. As God asks the grumpy prophet, should I not be concerned about Nineveh, in which are more than 120,000 persons, and also, I'm sure some know it, many animals, the animals as well. I mean, remarkable. Indeed, throughout Jonah, we find God engaging several facets of nature. God creates the sea and the dry land in chapter 1, verse 9. The Lord provides the fish that swallows Jonah, 1 verse 17. The Lord appoints the plant that comforts the prophet, 4 verse 7, and then the worm that attacks it. God also prepares the wind that blows warm air over Jonah, 4 verse 8, and then the animals in 4 verse 11. The stories about the flood and the prophet Jonah provide a helpful starting point for considering animals in relation to biblically grounded faith. If we squint, again going back to that picture I had at the beginning, reading attentive to creation language, we begin to see a different picture emerge. Again, the picture in that artwork is actually there. The old man is there, the two women are there. And again, I'd suggest that this animal narrative is there. They remind us that we're not alone, that we are creatures among creatures, unique among them, yes, made in the image of God, whatever that means, but creatures just the same. So what does this mean for those of us who want to serve God by serving the world God made, including planting a tree, as we'll be doing in the next few minutes? Everyone here, I assume, is on board with that. What does it mean for those of us who glimpse God in the wonders of nature and instinctively recoil when we see it polluted, when we see habitats destroyed and species lost? What does it mean for those of us horrified to see animals abused, hunted and fished to extinction, or suffering alongside us in the climate crisis, in forest fires and floods or droughts? I'm sure no one here would kick a kitten or pull a dog's tail, but here's the question that I think we might struggle with. We might agree not to kick the kittens or pull the dog's tail, but do we see this as a specifically Christian concern? And that's part of what I was wanting, just more as a visual aid to present on that chart in the back. That some of these themes that we find in the stories of Noah and Jonah, elements of that can be pursued into other texts, including New Testament texts. And it's not just the Father sees the sparrows that fall, but there are a number of ways that we can follow that high respect for creation into the New Testament world. So I'm keeping an eye on the clock, so I'm going to, start winding down here a little bit. There are ambiguities for sure when it comes to this topic, and those books that I was mentioning at the beginning will address all kinds of issues far better than I can. But I would propose that a theology that excludes, a walk of faith that is devoid of consideration for the rest of creation, misses part of the story. Something's fishy, Jonah reference, get it? Our ark is missing some passengers. In both the Noah and Jonah stories, we find a close connection between God's interactions with humanity and the natural world, ways of thinking about God's rescue of all creation, and not just us bipeds. I was going to say a little remark about two verses in the New Testament that I puzzle over, and every time I read them, it kind of makes me grimace. 1 Peter 3, verse 20, 2 Peter 2, verse 5, both refer to the Noah story, and both of them say that 8 people in all were saved from the flood, completely erasing the rest of the narrative, which in some ways the most interesting part of the narrative is the animals. But I wonder if, and I mean, far be it from me to criticize anything with Peter's name on it, but the idea of the erasure of the non-human in our Bible reading, I'm tempted to suggest that those are the first 2 examples of that very thing. Imagine a flood narrative, an ark story, a Noah story without any animals. Well, that's what we have in 1st and 2nd Peter. But maybe that illustrates, though, a little bit of our selective theologizing, our tendency to overlook animals. And that's why I put the question in the program there, that remark by Charles Spurgeon about whether or not the animals around us, are they better off because we are Christians? And I would suggest that they should be. Okay, I got a couple of minutes left, I think. I lost you. Okay, we're good. Okay. So as I wind down, I'm going to just step out of the lectern, as it were, and step into the pulpit again, so to speak. I'm not a preacher, and you can probably tell that. But this I'm going to shift back into in my attempt at preacher mode, and I'm going to put the animals to the side for just a moment, and I'll circle back to them as I close down. Generosity often follows gratitude in the Bible. When grace abounds, generosity is the next step. And we see this all the time. Israel cares for the stranger in the land, according to Deuteronomy 24. Why? Because they too were once strangers, displaced and separated from the protections and comforts of home. So Deuteronomy 24, 17 and 18 and 22. Or think of Zacchaeus, who also showed up. I'm ripping off Sylvia's talk from last night in all kinds of ways. That's it. Zacchaeus gives away half his possessions to the poor and offers to restore fourfold to anyone that he has defrauded. And I like that idea of the land and the seeds. I'm intrigued by that connection. But the generosity piece is what I flag here. And this was in response to Jesus' kindness that he received in Luke 19, verse 8, even though it was not required of him. That's one of the things about that story that's just so beautiful. Jesus doesn't ask him to do anything, but Zacchaeus does it anyway. And remember also that in Luke 18, just the previous chapter, we have the story of the rich man that Jesus does ask to do something. Give away all your money, and then you'll have what you're looking for. He didn't ask Zacchaeus, but he did it anyway. And Zacchaeus thus enacts that liberality of spirit that Jesus encourages elsewhere. Freely you have received, freely give. Even when it's within a person's rights to claim certain comforts or privileges, we often find instead self-sacrifice and an almost excessive liberality. The author of Ruth celebrates the heroine's chesed, kindness, which is evident in her willingness to leave her own people for Naomi's sake. Boaz praises this hesed as well. So far from self-serving, Ruth has her mother-in-law's best interests in mind when claiming this man as a redeemer, rather than seeking someone younger to marry, chapter 3, verse 10. As you read the Bible, take note how often such stories of faith-motivated largesse spill across boundaries. Israel's God-given bounty is not theirs to hoard, but rather to share with the sojourners in the land, meaning non-Israelites. Wealthy Zacchaeus reaches across the socioeconomic divide to the poor. A kind Samaritan ignores the racial and religious differences involved when he's lending a hand to a Jew at the side of the road. When Ruth puts the well-being of another ahead of herself, leaving behind her own family and people and God's to do so, she even resists Naomi's pleas to do otherwise. Ruth 1, verses 11, 15. Freely you've received, freely give, and in the process, defy conventions. And Jesus reminds us, avoid giving to those in a position to return, Luke 14. Animals can't always respond to our service to them. Do we place limits on our individual and collective responses to the grace of God? In various ways, biblical authors remind us to give when we receive, to give joyfully and not reluctantly, and to realize it is not up to us to determine who is my neighbor. So what does this have to do with our subject? Jump back into the lectern, sermon over. And then this is, I'll end with this, but in the spirit of Lewis's poem, shouldn't we be dancing with warthogs? Since the God of the Bible values animals, this much is obvious, I hope, from our earlier survey of the Noah story and Jonah story, what are the implications for people of faith? And I suggest a believer's response to God's grace must be gratitude embodied in a self-sacrificing, exuberant generosity to others. And like behaviors displayed in stories of Ruth and the Good Samaritan and 100 others, this generosity ought to transgress boundaries. And this is the part, though, where I think there's reluctance, at least in some corners of the church. If reconciliation encompasses all things in heaven and earth, see Romans 8, Ephesians 1, Colossians 1, then it befits the people of God to widen the ambit of care and concern to include all things. Jesus does not tell Zacchaeus to give away half his property, but the tax collector does. Naomi tells Ruth not to follow, but she does anyway. No one would have been surprised had the Samaritan passed by the injured Jew at the side of the road, but he didn't. Freely you've received, freely give. The scale of animal suffering is staggering and horrifying. Surely this ought to be of greater concern to the church than it is. And I'll leave with the question, what boundary-defying steps might we take as individuals, at least if not as community, to lift the burden of the groaning creation? And I'll just, we can jump to the very last slide, just as a recommendation. Two websites, and I mentioned the bottom one at the very beginning, David Clough, British theologian, who's doing remarkable things in the service of animals in the food system. But a very, very useful website. Includes educational opportunities for undergraduate students, if there are any students here. So a very, very good website to explore. And the top one, run by a fellow in London, Daryl Booth, also a wonderful website. You'll find lots of videos of recognizable speakers. You'll find articles written. You find there's a Lent guide and other resources that churches can use if they want to bring conversation about animals into the context of the worship life of the church. And with that, I'll close. So thank you very much. Okay.
Start thinking of your questions. Before you, stay up here. Michael, thank you. I want to thank you for provoking us to consider the absence of thoughtful theological thinking around non-humans. appreciate that. And personally, you said you're not a preacher, but I found myself personally quite challenged by the my scarcity mentality that I have around my kindness and my infatuation with priorities. And so I appreciate that. Thank you very much for that challenge in your talk today. So, I'm not going to go long in terms of do not touch the mic, but don't do it. Come up with your questions. There, that's the snap.
Are there any resources in addition to those few books I mentioned that people are aware of? I would always be.
Your book.
Oh, well, yeah. Thank you for the plug, Gord.
What's it called?
Eden's Other Residents, subtitled The Bible and Animals. Yeah. That was my first stab at this. That's a bad choice of terms. It's violent, but yeah.
I hope everybody can hear me. Thanks. What I find very interesting is that there's many pictures in different biblical type books of Jesus being surrounded by animals. Cattle, goats, donkeys, and birds. And at his feet, and even with the birth of Jesus, he's surrounded by animals when he's in the cradle. So I'm just wondering, how we can sort of get this connection together that the animals are a part of creation and that they should be included in our teachings and our prayer.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. Yeah, it's true that so often in paintings or whatever, we see Jesus surrounded by nature. And it's interesting about the manger story. It doesn't actually mention animals, which is very curious. We assume that they're there. And it's probably fair to say that every painting that's ever been done includes them. And even Charlie Brown's Christmas includes them. If you remember the scene, Lucy says to Snoopy, "You have to be all the animals in our play." and so there's something there that Luke has sort of,
Yeah.
I don't want to say omitted, but left aside. But
I'm just going to mention one other thing that Scott might find interesting, is that there's a running theme here with the watershed, is that we are baptized with water. And stories of water, the parting of the seas for the Israelites to go through. So there is a running theme here, so we need to sort of collectively get together with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah. Also, the St. Francis, I just thinking of your remark about Jesus and animals, but in later traditions, a number of the saints are associated with animals, St. Francis in particular. Yeah. I know what you're going to ask about, Brian.
No, I'm not.
Oh, okay.
No, I'm not going there. I'm curious how you got here. Because, I don't think Michael was sitting around one day thinking, oh, I'm getting tired of all the other biblical topics I could study, but for some reason, well, let's try this just for the fun of it. There's something else. Could you tell us something of the story about why this has become something which is not just a matter of intellectual curiosity, but a passion for you?
Yeah. Well, it began for me years ago. Antoinette Van Kuik, I think, is here. She'll remember this, but I used to have greyhounds. My wife and I had greyhounds in our house, and that was when I began to research what those dogs went through on the racetracks. They came from the southern United States, and I remember that I found that very troubling. It's a horrific life for those dogs, and it was around that time that the Job passage and writers like C.S. Lewis and others began to sort of cross my path, and so there was an interesting connection between kind of the reading I was doing at the time, but also this very real connection with these dogs that I had. Fruit Loops was the first name of the first one, and so I can credit her probably with triggering this. Yeah, that's another very formative experience. I volunteered for a number of years at the Winnipeg Humane Society, and that was a troubling education in some of the horrors that animals endure, but domestic animals particularly go through. So, but yeah, thank you for asking that. All right.
One of the other eclipses in the New Testament is how the Christian community begins to displace the Israelite or Jewish relationship with God and put itself as the new people, the new ethne or whatever that's in Christ. And I'm wondering if you see any connections between this kind of latent Christian supersessionism that starts to emerge and also the displacing of all of these other creatures that goes along with it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, and we heard this in an earlier session about the distance that was being created between the Jewish world and its creation theology. I don't know if that's sort of the direction you were thinking, but as we separated ourselves, as the church separated itself from the broader Jewish world, that they seem to have lost that connection. Yeah, I'm not sure what more I could add to that, but I think that's a very important point. And so it's fairly early on that we begin to see this drift away from an inclusion of animals in the conversation. There's some exceptions, like there's in the Acts of Thomas, for instance, there's a really lovely story about, and I forget what, it's that 3rd century, I forget exactly when that is, somewhere around there. But we have there examples of a Christian connection to animals. There's a wonderful story about Thomas meeting a donkey that speaks to him, and the donkey says that I am of the family of Balaam's donkey, and also of the family of the donkeys that carried a donkey that carried Jesus. And so here we have a Christian vision of bringing those old Israelite narratives, or the narrative of Balaam into the Christian world. But that's I think more of an exception than the rule. But yeah, thank you for that.
Your talk made me look a little bit squint-eyed. I heard a Good Friday sermon about when Jesus turned over the tables and the doves and the goats ran away. So they were liberated.
That's a very nice thought. There's actually an interesting article in one of these books on that storyline. Yeah, that we tend to think of the violence of the table, but in fact there's that liberation of the animals that were there for sacrificial purposes. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. Andy Alexis Baker, that's the author that maybe he preached the sermon you heard. I'm not sure, but yeah. I think we're done.
We have a lot of time. Yeah, but the schedule says 3:15.
I understand what the schedule says.
So, an example of one of these, well, why didn't I see that before? I was teaching a course on creation, environment, and the Bible, and you know how you break things down into different sections, and the section on the Psalms, of course, you've got Psalm 104, and then at the time, you know, people were reading the NIV, and I was reading the NRSV, and then I get to Psalm 36, your righteousness is like the highest mountains, your justice like the great deep, and we're familiar with that kind of language, and then the NIV says, you, Lord, preserve both people and animals. I says, yeah, that makes sense. But the translation of the NRSV reads, you save humans and animals alike, O Lord. And then you think, whoa, the word save.
Yeah. And what was the NIV again?
The NIV is you preserved both
Preserved. Yeah, very good.
people and animals. So translation matters.
Yes. Yeah.
And
okay.
I guess one could debate which is better, but to use the word save has lots of connotations.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because salvation is for whom? People, generally. That's how we used to think.
Yes.
So
yeah.
thank you for helping point this out.
Psalm 36. I can remember that. Thank you.
Okay, another great one, and the NIV actually has it just fine. It's in Colossians 1, where Paul's talking about the gospel, and he says, "This is the gospel that you heard, and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, have become a servant." Watch the commentators bend over backwards to say he's not talking about every creature under heaven. They have to bend over backwards. It's an overstatement for kind of to the whole world. But the text and the context is clear. Every creature, every animal.
Tapansa, isn't that
Yeah,
the phrase
tapansa.
that's over and over? Yeah, interesting. Yeah, thank you both for those comments. I'm going to follow up on both of those.
The good news, or some of the good news, is Michael is staying. He's still here, and there'll be more time to keep chatting. The reason why there's a mistake in the program in terms of timing is we are scheduled to start planting trees at 3:30 in our location, which we have to still transport ourselves to. So that's the reason why we're ending at this time. So thank you very much. Let's give another round of applause for Michael. Yes, so as soon as we break from here, please be sure to grab a quick coffee. We do have time for that. We do have time for round number 2 on baked goodies. This is now brought to you by Hildegard's, so it's not the same stuff, it's something new. So that gives you complete permission to eat more. So please do that. We will be gathering in the parking lot at 3:15 to gather and sort ourselves into what vehicles to drive over to do the tree planting. So I'll probably be waving again, but that's the timeline for that. Again, please don't forget, if you haven't participated in the art experience, please do so. This is another chance to do that. Let us break for more food.